today we're going to trim some plates. So I've let this plate dry, and that means that it needs to be dry in the center, which takes a little bit longer. So what we did here was we flipped this over and then we let this part dry once this was leather hard, because inevitably the rim of your plate is always going to dry a little bit faster than this part here. So a quick tip to help you prevent cracks, which really plates love to do, and warping, is after we trim this, you can either dry it upside down just like this to slow the drying of the rim down, or you can lay a piece of newspaper loose across the top once you put this on the shelf to be fired, and that also will slow the drying of the rim down. That way it's not contracting just here and pulling on all of this through here. So that's just a little tip to help out with ceramics. You always want to kind of try to dry stuff as slow as possible. So we're going to start by recentering this plate. And tools that you're going to need for this part of plate making is a bucket of water, just in case you need it to rinse off tools, your hands. Clean hands and tools mean clean projects in the end. I also like to keep my different sizes of ribs, soft finishing ribs, near me. These are great tools. A needle tool. I also have here a large loop tool, a small loop tool if you want or prefer to use this size tool, and then I also have here some clay, and this is for worms. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to start by recentering this pot. So because of its low profile, it's a little tougher to tap this to center. So I'm just going to go ahead and draw a light line and do it this way, the centering process. And what I'm looking for here is I'm looking at the distance between the line I drew and the edge of the object I'm trimming. So where you have a skinnier part of your circle means you have less clay, and where you've got a thicker line, you've got more. So you want to move the direction that you have less clay. So that's that way for me. Just move it a little bit at a time. If you try to move it by leaps and bounds, you'll be here all day trying to recenter your project. Okay, and then you draw another line. That looks pretty good. So what we're going to do now is we're going to attach this to the bat, the plate to the bat. When you are using worms on short projects like this, your worms need to be pretty small. Because of COVID, it is difficult to sanitize sponges, so the sponge bats will not be available. So I would recommend trying this way. If you don't lock it down to this bat, it will fly off the wheel. Some potters like to wet the project on the rim and not use any worms at all. You're more than welcome to try that. This is just how I work. So I've got a pretty small skinny worm here. And I'm going to put that, if this round thing had corners, I would be putting a worm at 4 corners. Okay, so that looks like that. I've pushed it more toward the bat than I did into the plate. So that means that I've got a little bit of room here for my tool. Okay, so we're going to start with our larger loop tool, and I usually use the small end of the tool to establish my foot ring. So I'm holding this with my finger toward the working end of the tool right at the neck here, and I hold it in the palm of my hand like that. I also have one hand reserved for the pot, and then one finger will generally hold the tool steady. So what I'm doing here is I am going to start by establishing the foot ring of the plate. So you want to go down a little bit further than what you'll end up with, because as I go to trim a curve down here later, I'll lose some of that width. That'll make sense as you go along. So my tool's straight up and down. And I've just established the depth of the foot ring. Now what I'm going to do before I go any further is I'm going to start trimming this part here. So I'm shaping this. Now if you watched in the first video on the throwing, remember that this is one of your weak points right here. This is where I've seen a lot of plates separate in the drying process, where you've got a ring for the plate rim and then you've got the plate bottom, because this cracks all the way around. So just be cognizant of how thin you trim this. And it may happen, it's always a learning curve, but you'll get it. Just be tenacious like all of us potters are. So if I was here with my tool, I'm going to shift that tool down. It doesn't really matter which end you use. It's whatever's easiest for you to see. And I've got it tipped just angled away from these worms so that I don't catch them. And once I get this undercut here, then I can slowly start drifting that tool down. So that looks like this. I slowly start drifting it down so that I can trim a little bit more away toward the center of the rim. If you're not comfortable using the large loop tool, then use the small loop tool. It's whatever works for you for these tools, so I can show you what that looks like as well. You would hold it in the same way. And just trim away a little bit at a time. Don't forget to come through and periodically test. Remember, it's the ripe fruit test. So if you push on your pot and there is resistance to it, that means that your fruit is not ripe and you can trim some more, right? If you push and it's spongy or springy, then that means that your fruit is overripe or ripe, and it's either a thin wall or a wet pot. In either case, you want to stop trimming for a second and dry it out, and or don't trim anymore because you're about to trim through the wall. So every few passes with my tool, I'll stop the wheel and kind of push on it so that I can feel whether that's getting thin or not. Okay, so once you've got your rim trimmed and you're happy with that part there, then you're just going to address this foot here. There's a lot of different ways that you can shape a foot. You can round it out. You can leave it square like it looks right now. You can make it thinner. It's really up to you. I like to kind of do sort of a swoop in here. So how I do that is I kind of tilt my tool away from the foot a little bit, and I'm undercutting, I'm catching it underneath this part of the rim here of the foot. So remembering, if you're doing this, that if you have your tool straight up and down, you're just going to trim away the foot that you just made. So if you're trying to undercut this, you need to tip the tool away from the plate that you're trimming. Okay, and then the last thing I'm going to do is bevel this outside edge here. So I just catch it on the top. And then we'll round that out just a little bit. So I kind of come through and fuss with it until I'm happy. All right. So now what we're going to do is address the interior of the plate. We want to trim a little bit of this away, and that helps also. We can come through with our rib and compress this down to, again, try to prevent those cracks that love to form in plates. So I'm going to come and start this with the tip of my large loop tool here. And again, if you would prefer to use this tool, that's just fine. I'm going to air about 1/4 of an inch in, so where my nail is drawing a line there. I can always take away, but I can't add back if I trim off too much. So we'll start there, and we're just getting a little gully established. If your tool chatters on you, it means that you're pushing a little too hard, so lighten up your touch. And if your plate is too thin to do this, don't worry about trimming it. Just compress it really well with a rib and dry it very slow. I usually will leave enough so that I can trim the underneath of the plates that I make. So once I get this established, now I'm going to carve this part out. So you can think of your pot with a T in the center. I'm really only trimming this part as the wheel spins. It will naturally, we don't trim all the way across is what I mean, because if you go on the opposite side of your T, the wheel is fighting against your tool. So try to keep your tool center and to the right if you're a right-handed thrower, or center and to the left if you have your wheel spinning that direction for left-hand throwers. So another thing is, when you're holding this tool, you want to tip your wrist up a little bit so that it's catching the underneath part of the tool. That way it's actually cutting. If you have it flat, it's not cutting and it's also hitting here. So you tip your wrist up a little. So I think that that's probably thin enough. Now what I'm going to do is address this part here. So I want to refine the inside of this rim and maybe make this a little less chunky in terms of the width of that foot ring. So I'm just going to take either end of my tool and we're going to come in straight and just trim that to where it looks a little more refined. And then we'll bevel this edge here. Okay, the last thing that you want to do is take your finishing ribs, whichever size you're more comfortable using, and we're just going to, with a little bit of water, not a lot, a little bit of water goes a long way. If you use too much water at this point, you're wiping away fine particles of clay and leaving just grog, and that you can see in the glazing. So the water is just really to help it slide a little easier. And I'm just taking the flat edge of this tool, tipping it away from me a little bit, and I'm using that to kind of delete the tool marks that I've just made. All right. So now we've got our plate trimmed, and then you can come with just a little bit of water on your fingers and just soften up the rim. It shouldn't have too many marks on it because we were trimming leather hard. So that is really key when you're trimming anything, is to be patient for that right consistency. So leather hard would be like a really yummy, nice cheese like Manchego or Parmesan. Something that you can peel away with your cheese cutter. Okay, so that is the trimming of the plate. And then when you set this on the shelf to be fired, either throw a piece of newspaper across the top, or you can dry this upside down. Either way, just something to slow the rim down and let this catch up so that it's a little more evenly distributed as it's drying. I'm going to alter this plate. If you want to leave the rim as is, that's just fine. After a brief pause here, we'll come back and I'll show you how you can change the look of the plate by cutting into the rim a little bit and adding bits to the outside, which is just another little extra fun thing you can play around with if you wish. All right, we'll be back.